Reed Calver chose the largest room in the building to question my loyalty. Ungrateful, he said, pacing slowly. After 15 years here, you're interviewing elsewhere, 200 employees packed into the town hall. And somehow the word landed only on me. A few nervous laughs. A few people staring at their shoes. I stood there, hands clasped, pulse steady out of habit. And before I tell you what happens next, quickly look at your watch and tell me what time you're listening. Okay, if you're still here with me, leave your lucky number in the comments. Now back to the room where my clock seems to have completely stopped ticking. I'm Luna Carter, Director of Compliance and Risk. For 15 years, I've signed off on every contract above $5 million. I've rebuilt our internal controls after a regulatory scare. I once blocked a partnership that would have exposed us to an $18.4 million penalty. The press never wrote about that, and especially my salary. 15 years, not one raise. Reed was hired 18 months ago to accelerate performance. His compensation package includes a 7-figure bonus if he closes the pending $280 million merger. He speaks in phrases like velocity, streamlined oversight, and reduced friction. By friction, he means me, after he declared me ungrateful in the middle of the auditorium. I folded my hands and kept my voice steady. I applied for an interview. That's all. He tilted his head. Amused. If someone feels undervalued, maybe they should examine their commitment. Commitment. By noon, HR sent the email transition discussion scheduled Friday. Public shaming first, process later. What Reed either forgot or never bothered to learn is that our internal governance policy requires immediate notification to the audit committee if the director of compliance position changes, and once that notice is triggered. Certain safeguards don't rely on personalities, they rely on procedure. What you've just witnessed is only the tip of the iceberg. The next chapter will delve deeper, and some moments will be dramatized. Furthermore, I'm using AI as a storytelling tool to sharpen the message and enhance the emotional impact. Not to distort the truth, but to illuminate it. I hope you have a peaceful evening, with a relaxed mind, to listen to this story. By Tuesday, the humiliation had evolved into something quieter and far more deliberate. I wasn't fired yet. I was being erased. Reed removed me from 2 strategic meetings tied to the pending $280 million merger. No explanation. My calendar simply updated itself. Then, he approved a $42 million vendor contract without waiting for my compliance sign-off, a step that had been mandatory for 15 years. When I asked about it, he didn't lower his voice. Growth doesn't wait for paperwork, he said, as if governance were a hobby I practiced after hours. By Wednesday afternoon, my access to the risk dashboard was revoked, the same dashboard I built after our near-miss regulatory review 8 years ago. IT claimed it was a permissions adjustment. I called it surgical isolation. Colleagues stopped dropping by. A few sent sympathetic texts. No one wanted to be seen standing too close to red tape. That was the new label for my department. Red tape. Not risk prevention. Not fiduciary duty. Just friction. The irony was almost impressive. For 15 years, I had protected the company from exposure that would have wiped out entire quarters of revenue. Now I was the inconvenience. HR confirmed my role redundancy in a tone usually reserved for software updates. Clean, neutral, reversible. Apparently, what Reed didn't mention, and likely didn't understand, was that our governance policy requires immediate notification to the audit committee when the head of compliance departs without a qualified successor in place. That notice went out automatically. The weekend arrived with an eerie kind of quiet. The sort that feels less like peace and more like pressure building behind a sealed door. I didn't send emails. I didn't make calls. I didn't warn anyone. I simply packed a few folders from my home office and waited. The audit committee received the automated notification the director of compliance position had been vacated without a certified successor in place. Under our governance charter, that single change triggered a mandatory independent review. No vote required, no personality involved. Procedure doesn't negotiate, it executes. I imagined the alert appearing in their inboxes, stamped with policy language I had drafted years earlier after our near-miss regulatory incident. The rule had seemed excessive back then, redundant. Now it was simply active, read. I later learned. Called the chair of audit within hours. She's replaceable, he said. Apparently irritated that a routine staffing decision had escalated into oversight. We'll appoint someone internally, but the policy was precise, until a qualified compliance officer was formally vetted and approved. An external audit firm had to assess exposure tied to pending material transactions, and we had a $280 million merger classified as material. The board retained an outside audit firm on an expedited basis. The language in their engagement letter was sterile review of risk governance, contract authorization procedures, and regulatory disclosure controls, clinical words, expensive implications. I remained silent. I didn't need to orchestrate anything. The system I built was doing exactly what it was designed to do, remove discretion from moments of pressure. Another consequence surfaced. The investment bank financing the merger requested confirmation that the independent review would not affect disclosure accuracy. Until then, they paused the initial funding tranche, $60 million, temporarily frozen. No alarms rang publicly, no headlines appeared, but beneath the polished executive updates, something fundamental had shifted. The wave had started moving. The quiet tension from the weekend finally surfaced as something tangible. The first $60 million of merger financing was officially frozen. Not canceled, not withdrawn, suspended. Pending clarification, on paper. It looked procedural. Inside the building, it felt like structural damage spreading through steel beams no one had inspected. The acquiring partner requested formal risk clarification tied to governance continuity. They weren't accusing us of misconduct. They were asking whether internal controls remained intact without a certified compliance officer in place. It was a measured question, delivered in corporate language. But it carried weight. Our stock slid 4% in a single morning. Analysts called it temporary uncertainty. Investors tend to punish uncertainty faster than they punish bad news. Reed stormed into the executive conference room where the external auditors were already reviewing documentation. I wasn't present, but panic travels faster than email. "This is retaliation," he said, loud enough for half the floor to hear. She knew this would stall the deal. The company's general counsel responded evenly. "This is governance. Reed, the policy predates you." He argued we could appoint someone internally on an interim basis, not without formal vetting and board approval. Counsel replied, "Until a qualified compliance officer is approved, we cannot execute disclosure certifications tied to a material transaction. In plain terms, no valid signature, no closing." The freeze wasn't symbolic. Without updated compliance certifications, regulatory disclosures could not be filed. Without those filings, the financing remained paused. Without financing, the merger timeline slipped. Reed shifted from public confidence to visible frustration. He questioned the auditor's scope. He suggested the policy was excessive. None of that altered the charter language. Then the independent audit team delivered its preliminary observation. During document review, they identified 3 recently executed contracts totaling $96 million that lacked documented risk assessments consistent with established procedure. They weren't alleging wrongdoing. They were documenting a mission. And a mission, in compliance, has a way of expanding under scrutiny. What do you think of Reed's choices so far? Reckless leadership or calculated arrogance, if you believe this is the type of behavior that led to catastrophic failure? Leave a 2 in the comments. Your participation is not just support. It lets the algorithm know that this story matters, and so does accountability. Once the freeze settled into routine updates and controlled statements, the real shift began with paperwork. Audits don't explode. They unfold. And as the external firm moved from preliminary review to detailed examination, the tone inside the executive floor changed from defensive to cautious. Their findings were not dramatic in delivery, but they were precise. 3 recently executed contracts totaling $96 million lacked documented compliance sign-off consistent with established policy. The signatures were present. The risk assessments were not. In one case, a vendor agreement revealed a potential conflict of interest involving a subcontractor connected to a senior executive's prior investment network. It wasn't illegal on its face. It was undisclosed. The auditors requested my archived correspondence. I didn't need to dramatize anything. The record spoke clearly. I had issued 3 separate written warnings regarding accelerated approvals tied to those contracts. Each memo outlined exposure scenarios, disclosure obligations, and recommended delay pending review. Each memo had been acknowledged. None had been implemented. Reed's response was immediate and predictable. "She overreacts to everything," he told the room. According to the general counsel, compliance always assumes worst case. One of the audit partners replied evenly that my concerns were consistent with regulatory guidance and aligned with internal governance standards adopted after our prior incident years earlier. In other words, my warnings were not dramatic. They were procedural. That distinction mattered. For the first time since the town hall, the conversation was no longer about my attitude or loyalty. It was about documented deviation from policy. Power began shifting in small, almost imperceptible increments. Questions directed at me now carried weight rather than skepticism. Questions directed at Reed carried scrutiny. Then another development surfaced. One of the merger counterparties requested direct confirmation from the former director of compliance that risk governance remained reliable during the transition. They wanted me on record. I hadn't initiated that request. But suddenly, the company that had labeled me friction needed my signature to reassure the market. The call came not as an accusation, but as an invitation. The tone alone told me everything had shifted. The board chair's voice was measured, almost careful. "Luna, we'd appreciate your perspective, not clarification, not defense, perspective." That was new. I joined the video conference to find the same executives who had remained silent during the town hall now leaning forward. Attentive. The audit committee members looked less like overseers and more like stakeholders recalculating exposure. Reed was there too. Expression tight, posture rigid. The chair began directly. The board wanted continuity, stability. They wanted the market reassured. They wanted the merger salvaged. Then the offer came, a 120% salary increase, formal promotion to Chief Compliance Officer, a retention bonus structured around governance milestones rather than revenue acceleration, direct reporting access to the audit committee. For a moment, the irony almost amused me. 15 years without a raise. Now urgency had a price tag. Before I responded, Reed cut in. "This sets a dangerous precedent," he said sharply. "Rewarding disruption encourages it." The audit chair didn't hesitate. So does bypassing governance. Silence followed, the kind that redefines hierarchy without raising voices. The discussion shifted from retention to risk containment. The independent audit had moved beyond documentation gaps. The auditors were now evaluating decision-making authority tied to the unreviewed contracts. Specifically, they were examining whether governance controls had been intentionally overridden. That language matters. Intentionally overridden. Reed attempted to reframe the narrative as strategic urgency, arguing that speed was essential in competitive markets, but urgency is not a defense under fiduciary standards. It is context, not exemption. By the time the call ended, the dynamic was unmistakable. The board wasn't negotiating with me out of courtesy. They were recalibrating around accountability, and as the auditors expanded their scope, the question quietly emerging was no longer about replacing me. It was about personal liability at the executive level. The phrase that changed the temperature in the room wasn't shouted. It was delivered in a calm, almost academic tone by outside counsel. Personal liability. Up until that moment, the discussion had been about process gaps and governance continuity. Now it shifted to intent. if it could be demonstrated that established compliance procedures were knowingly bypassed. The exposure would not rest solely with the corporation. It could attach to the individual who authorized the deviation. I said nothing. I didn't need to. The email chain spoke clearly, one by one. The audit team projected the correspondence onto the screen. My initial memo outlining risk exposure tied to the accelerated vendor approvals. My follow-up warning noting disclosure obligations. My final message recommending delay pending review. Each email was acknowledged. None altered the timeline. Reed leaned back, jaw tight. "Everyone cuts corners," he said, attempting to normalize what the documents rendered specific. "That's how deals move." An audit partner responded evenly. Without inflection, "Compliance isn't a corner." Silence followed. Not the awkward silence of disagreement, but the heavier kind that forms when facts refuse reinterpretation. The general counsel clarified the stakes. If the bypass was deemed intentional, and if that omission materially affected disclosure tied to a pending transaction, regulators could examine executive accountability. Indemnification provisions have limits when conduct crosses from oversight error into deliberate disregard. Reed shifted tactics. He framed the acceleration as strategic necessity, suggested my risk posture was overly conservative, and implied that the board had implicitly endorsed speed over caution. No one confirmed that interpretation. I remained quiet. There is power in allowing documentation to perform its function. I had spent years building systems designed to remove emotion from accountability. Watching them operate was almost clinical. Then another development surfaced. The $42 million vendor agreement, one of the contracts lacking formal risk documentation, was paused by the counterparty. They requested updated disclosure clarification before proceeding. Until resolved, performance obligations would be suspended. The room recalibrated instantly. This was no longer theoretical exposure. It was operational consequence. Reed's confidence didn't vanish all at once. It thinned. And for the first time, the cost of moving fast became measurable. The emergency meeting with the investor was scheduled quickly, but nothing about it felt rushed. Tension has a way of slowing time. I joined the call as a former executive, not yet reinstated, but still the person whose signature had anchored the company's risk certifications for 15 years. That irony was not lost on anyone. The lead representative from the acquiring firm opened without small talk. Their tone was controlled, professional, and unmistakably cautious. "Before we proceed," he said, "we need clarity. Clarity is a polite word for doubt." He looked directly at me through the screen. "Is the company stable under current leadership?" The room held its breath. I could feel Reed watching me, waiting for either loyalty or betrayal. I offered neither. "Governance has been inconsistent," I said evenly. "Established compliance procedures were not uniformly followed in recent transactions. The independent audit is addressing those gaps." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't embellish. I described facts. Reed reacted immediately. "This is being exaggerated," he snapped. "We moved quickly to stay competitive. There was no misconduct." The investor didn't respond to his volume. "We're not discussing misconduct," he said calmly. "We're discussing reliability. Reliability is what underwrites financing. Reliability is what stabilizes valuation. Without it, capital hesitates." The investor continued, "Our risk committee needs assurance that oversight will be strengthened before we release additional funding." That phrasing mattered. Not corrected, strengthened. It implied deficiency without accusation. Reed attempted to redirect the conversation toward projected synergies and operational efficiencies. He spoke about growth metrics and integration timelines. The investor interrupted gently. "Growth is secondary to control." Control. The word lingered. Then the request came, framed as a condition rather than a suggestion. The investor required changes in oversight leadership before proceeding with the transaction. Specifically, they wanted governance reporting to shift away from operational management and directly under board supervision. In practical terms, that meant removing compliance oversight from under Reed's authority. The silence that followed was public and irreversible. I had not demanded anything. I had not lobbied. I had answered a question, but in that moment, the balance of power moved in plain sight. The board meeting was closed door, but its consequences were anything but private. When governance shifts from discussion to vote, tone becomes procedural and outcomes become measurable. I was not inside the room, yet I understood exactly how the conversation would unfold. Documentation rarely leaves much room for interpretation. The audit committee presented the findings first: the $96 million in contracts lacking documented compliance sign-off, the undisclosed conflict exposure, the suspended $42 million agreement pending clarification, the paused merger financing. Each point was tied to policy language, not emotion. Then came the motion of formal review of Reed Calver's authority pending completion of the independent audit. It wasn't framed as punishment. It was described as risk containment. The board voted to temporarily suspend his authority to execute new contracts or certify transaction documents. Operational leadership would continue, but oversight would shift directly to the audit committee. That distinction was surgical. Word reached me within the hour. Shortly after, my phone rang. "Reed, you orchestrated this," he said, voice stripped of the confidence he'd displayed at the town hall. "You built the trap." I let the accusation settle before responding. "Number one," I said evenly. "You signed it." There was a pause. Then an exhale heavy with realization. Systems don't retaliate, they record. As the suspension circulated internally, external counsel briefed the board on next steps. If the audit expanded into regulatory disclosure concerns, the company could face inquiries beyond internal governance. The longer the uncertainty persisted, the greater the exposure not just to valuation, but to executive accountability. The recommendation that followed was framed as strategic preservation to prevent escalation and reassure investors. The board requested Reed's voluntary resignation pending final audit conclusions. Voluntary carries a particular corporate tone. It implies choice where outcome has already narrowed. By evening, the internal announcement was drafted: leadership transition, commitment to governance, continued cooperation with auditors. Justice did not arrive with spectacle. It arrived through vote counts and signature authority. For the first time since the word ungrateful echoed across that town hall, accountability felt less theoretical. When the board asked if I was willing to return, I surprised them by saying no, not out of anger, not out of pride, simply because the structure had changed, and so had I. Going back as an employee would have meant stepping into the same hierarchy that had allowed governance to be dismissed as inconvenience. I wasn't interested in repeating that cycle. Instead, I proposed terms: independent advisory council, hourly compensation at 4 times my previous salary, direct reporting to the audit committee, not through operations, no ambiguity in authority, no dilution of oversight. They agreed faster than they had ever approved a raise. Reed's resignation became official the following week. The announcement framed it as a strategic transition, but everyone inside the building understood what had happened. Governance had not overreacted. It had activated, and the layers of consequence financing pauses, contract suspensions, investor pressure, audit expansion had converged into something undeniable. The merger did not collapse. It was restructured, revised disclosure language, reinforced review checkpoints, formal separation between operational leadership and compliance oversight. The process took longer. It closed cleaner. From my new position, I watched the culture recalibrate. Questions once labeled obstruction became standard agenda items. Risk assessment was no longer treated as friction. It was treated as infrastructure. That shift, more than any title, was the outcome I cared about. I was never ungrateful. I was consistent. Loyalty isn't obedience. Compliance isn't paperwork. And dignity is never ingratitude. There was no dramatic courtroom verdict, no public scandal, just signatures placed carefully, votes recorded formally, and accountability applied methodically. The justice was cold, but it was precise, legal, logical, layered. And this time, no one laughed when I spoke. I didn't win because I was louder. I won because I kept records, honored process, and refused to confuse loyalty with silence. The practical lesson is simple: document your work. Understand the policies that govern you, and never surrender your professional standards to protect someone else's ego. Emotionally, I learned that humiliation loses power when you stay grounded in facts. Humanely, I learned that systems can protect people if people are brave enough to use them. If you were in that room, labeled ungrateful for wanting fairness, what would you do? Would you shrink to keep the peace? Or would you trust the framework you helped build? Integrity rarely feels dramatic in the moment. It feels lonely, but it compounds. I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? Different cities, different time zones, same tension between self-respect and survival. If this story speaks to you, consider subscribing. One subscription helps this message reach someone who's being told they're too much for asking for basic fairness. A like tells the platform that accountability matters. A comment lets others know they're not isolated. And when you share this video, you might be giving someone the clarity to document, to question, to protect themselves. You're not just watching a story, you're amplifying it. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.